tuning into BaisWave.
Welcome to the newest episode of Everything IS, where we talk about everything there is to know about studying international studies at Leiden University. I am Annika, a second-year IS student, and I will be your host today. As the deadline for the first-year IS students is approaching to choose a region, we will, in this episode and in the coming episodes, dive deeper into each region to hopefully help you pick a region. So if you're first-year IS students who soon has to choose, or you're second or third-year IS students and just want to know a little bit more about what it's like to study other regions, these episodes will be perfect for you. With who am I sitting now?
Hi, I'm Pia.
And which region do you study?
I'm currently studying Africa.
Well, I'm excited to talk to you more about what it's like to study Africa. So to start off with, why did you choose Africa?
That's a very good question. I think for me, growing up in a European school system, it's very Eurocentric, and being able to look at all different subjects and different topics from a different view is like the main thing that drew me to choosing Africa.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something to say about like choosing a region that maybe you don't know a lot about and you don't have a lot in school about. What do you think is kind of a misconception about the region Africa in the IS context, like studying Africa?
Well, in general, I think we have a tendency to look at Africa as one united entity, and I think that's like the first thing we have to de-learn in a sense. And then with politics and international studies, I feel like we have this with this whole idea that all of Africa is the same, we also have this preconcept notion of like what African politics look like, what African economies look like, and what it means to be an African country, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And going off on that, like Africa, what you said, Africa does get treated a lot of the time as like a single entity, but it has so many cultures, so many countries. How do you deal like with the challenge of studying that many countries, that many cultures? How does IS deal with that?
So the thing the lecturers have done, and I really like this, is that we often focus on a concept or a topic, for example in politics, and then we use countries as examples. So talking about like a military coup, then we talk about a country where that's occurred. Africa consists of 54 countries, and you're not able to learn everything about every country in this short amount of time we have. So being able to associate a topic or a theme with a certain event really helps.
Yeah, that sounds nice, and I think that's good to know for the listeners as well, because I think Africa is so big, so many countries, so diverse, it can be maybe a little bit intimidating on where to start even. Do you feel like studying Africa more in depth gave you new perspectives on seeing the world?
I really do think so, yeah. As we talked about, like growing up in the European school system, you have this very Eurocentric, very standardized in a way of looking at the world and how different things affect each other and how they generally work. I think studying Africa, talking with lecturers who know a lot about the continent but also come from the continent, you're forced to look at yourself from the outside and be like, oh, well, I think of this, say climate change, I think this and this and this about this, but it's important to like acknowledge all the factors and all the things that have affected you in ending up with the view you have. So I think studying Africa really has helped me put stuff in perspective, but also myself and how I view the world and how it's very much influenced by, the European mindset that's implemented in you from the start.
So it really challenges your belief system.
It definitely does. And I think it's important, and I feel like more people should be challenged in that way. Yeah.
Yes, definitely. You have a subject in the first year, second semester, African history. Now, Africa has a very rich history and a very
Yeah.
long history because it's the birthplace of humankind.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you guys approach that? Do you guys start very early, like really at the first humans, or do you guys start later? Or
I think, don't quote me on this, but we might be the region that's like starts furthest back. So if I remember correctly, we actually started like with the creation of the earth, and we talked a lot about how nature and landscape has affected history and how it's shaped African history.
all right, nice. No, I think that's good to know, and I think that's also interesting because I think most regions, not all, but most, they start a bit later,
Yeah.
like 200 years ago, something
Mhm.
like that. So I think it's also very interesting to have a region that starts that early.
No, and it can sound like very overwhelming when we say, oh, we started at the start of the earth, basically, but start of the creation of the earth. But I think it teaches you also about how everything is interconnected, and it's not something static. It's a creation in a way.
Yes, definitely. Hey, I want to talk about African politics as well because, again, Africa has so many countries, there's so much happening politically.
Mm-hmm.
Are you looking at bigger trends in the region? Are you looking at specific cases in countries?
So
How did that get approached?
I think, as like I mentioned before, in general, the whole approach to studying Africa in this course is that we talk about a certain topic or a certain, say, way of rule, and then we look at examples from African countries. Yeah.
All right, nice. And then also economics. Africa economics, I think, is really interesting because...
It's my favorite subject.
Can you tell me a little bit maybe about why it's your favorite subject?
Well, I think it's a long history, like why I became interested in econ when I came here. I've always like thought of econ and economics as like, oh, the finance bros and like people who only want to become rich, and that's the people who care about economics. But then I think having principle of economics in the first year here really like started my growth, my econ journey. And I really understood that, well, a lot of things are based on economics, and it really shapes the world. And a good understanding of how econ works gives you a better understanding of how the world works. And then when we started to have Economy Africa this fall, this semester, it's very interesting to look at economic structures and ideas from another perspective, but also how it's very much like how Western ideas, like how they work in Africa, how they don't work, and how we have a tendency to be like, African economies don't work because of, but it's based on this European idea of
what makes an economy successful.
Yeah.
No, I think that's very interesting that like maybe the European idea of capitalism is different than the African idea of capitalism, or just...
And all the factors that influence capitalism and that shapes an economy in general, they're so different, and the history behind the societies are also so different. So you can't really compare it, but it has this tendency to always be compared and then always losing out in a way because it's not the same as Europe.
No, definitely. And last year I talked to someone at the area fair, and they said to me that a big misconception about studying Africa is that you're going to talk a lot about colonialism, while the focus is more on pre-colonial history and post-colonial history. Do you want to elaborate maybe a little bit on that?
I think because colonialism shaped so much of the Africa we see today, it's an integral part that we have to learn about. But it's, as you said, it's so important. We learn about pre-colonial history, and also now we really focus on post-colonial times and how to, in a way, Africa has gotten its agency back, but at the same time we have to acknowledge that a lot of the structures and a lot of the ideas of colonialism continue to rule, both like within African countries, but also, within the rest of the world.
Yes, definitely. And I think it's good that there's also a bit more focus on not the colonial period. It kind of gives Africa's identity maybe a little bit back. Culture and languages.
Yes.
Well, Africa, and I might be wrong for this, but I think it's the most language diverse region we have. So, like, how does IS deal with that? Like, when it comes to the subject culture and language?
For culture and language, we had, well, again, I feel like it's the same structure of every the other subjects. It's you have a case or you have a way of communicating, or we had a lot about like what's it called, nonverbal communication, and where we, for example, talked about how in certain parts of Africa they communicate through wearing something called kanga, which is a skirt or a piece of fabric, and then we looked at specific cases and case studies where this was done.
Yep. The kanga, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, is really interesting to me. Someone told me a little bit about it, and it's very fascinating, so guys, search it up. Why do you believe students should choose to study Africa? Okay.
So I think you should choose to study Africa because, well, you're able to learn about all the topics I've just talked about. You get this new perspective on how to look at things. And also, as someone who grew up in the European school system, and I think a lot of you did, you're able to look at things from a completely new perspective. And that's really interesting. And it's fun to learn new stuff, and it like challenges a lot of the preconceived notions you have about simple topics such as climate change. Yeah.
Yes, definitely. And what would you say is one of the most fun things you learned about, or you found the most interesting thing that you learned about?
I think the most fun thing about studying Africa is, well, as we talked about, like you're able to challenge your preset like ideas and notions. And for example, we talk a lot about states and like what a state is in this course, and I think challenging your ideas of what a good state is and looking at it from an African perspective where the idea of a state was imported through colonialism or the European state. So looking at it from that perspective, and also then everything surrounding it, what we deem important and what we tell others that is important. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that definitely sounds very interesting to me too. Last question. If you would describe Africa in one word, what would it be?
Diverse.
I think that's a really good word.
And also back to the question about like why you should choose Africa, we also have the best lecturers and tutors. So
you heard it here first, guys. Africa has amazing lecturers, but I think all lecturers are amazing.
But the African ones are the best.
Especially the ones that give me high grades. No,
well, the Africa ones do.
Well, thank you so much for being here. I feel like it was very interesting to learn a bit more about what it entails to study the region Africa in international studies.
Thank you for having me. Next up, we have the North America region. So, as you might hear, I'm not the usual interviewer, but since our usual interviewer, Annika, is going to be the one answering the questions, she's been switched out, swapped.
Replaced.
Replaced. Yeah, so, well, I said your name, but who are you?
Well, my name is Annika, and I focus on North America.
What made you choose North America as your region?
I always thought North America was very fascinating from when I was younger and watched those high school movies, and most of the songs I listened to were American from a pretty early age. And also America is so often in the news, so that made me kind of passionate about it. And also I remember when I was like 15, there was like the big election was happening Biden versus Donald Trump, and I remember I was like following that in high school already, and it just made me so interested in American politics.
No, but as you said, the US is, or North America, but mainly the US is very prevalent in mainstream media, and I think a lot of us have this, we've created this idea of what the US is and what US politics is. But do you think this can lead to some misconceptions, and maybe like, what's the biggest misconception about North America?
I think the biggest misconception about studying North America is that it's easy or simple just because it is in the global media a lot, because in reality it's quite complicated, and it's not just as simple as what's put in the headlines. There were a lot of like quite complex political structures or economic forces or cultural forces that are moving. So I think it's a mistake to think that just because we hear a lot about America knows we actually know a lot about America.
Yeah. So, well, this then kind of ties into the next question of why do you think people should choose to study North America as their region?
I think people should choose it because it is, whether you like it or not, it is a global power. It's one of the richest countries on earth. It has influenced, especially as someone from Europe, it has influenced European politics, but it has influenced politics all over the world. And that's why I think it's really important to study North America, because it has an influence on, at least here in Europe, on your daily lives. A lot of cultural things are like blown over from America. And I think because they're quite a lot in the news, and you could make a fair argument that maybe America is too much in the news, it does mean that America is an important world player, and I feel like it does mean that we should specialize in what's actually going on there and how it's happening, and just a bit more cultural, political, economic background to actually have a better understanding. And I also think it gives quite a good advantage when it comes to job markets, because if you're gonna work in any organization that has to do with trade, I think America is one of your biggest countries you're gonna work with, or even if you want to join like an international politics organization, you're definitely gonna deal with America or something related to America. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. And as I assume our listeners here, this is very US based, but because this is North America, so how much do you talk about Mexico and Canada?
Well, I will be honest with the listeners. If you choose North America, you choose the US. You don't study Canada. I think you have one language lecture on Canada, but I didn't have that. It got canceled in my year. And you study Mexico in relation to the US, so as a trading partner when it comes to immigration. But when you choose North America, you choose the US. So I think that's a good expectation to set. If you really want to learn about Canada or Mexico, you're not going to find it when you choose North America. But with that being said, because you focus on just the US, you do go very deep into everything.
Throughout the course, we have a lot of region-specific subjects. For example, economy, history, and politics. Do you have like a core thing that you're going to take with you from one of these courses?
I mean, I think American politics is so interesting, especially with everything that's happening right now, because it really does. But even for history, it's the same. It gives you so much context on how it ended up being where it is right now, and how certain people get elected and the choices that are being made. It really gives you so much context. So I think that's something that I will take with me, is just when I see now America in the news, like even when I see America and Dutch news, I feel like I'm a lot more critical on how it gets reported, but just in news in general. So,
and then talking about like current politics, would you say that current politics are very much influencing this course? So say you talk about daily occurrences or happenings and like changes in US politics in the course.
We do, and I think that's a really special thing about our course. Because for history, we start quite late. We start after the Great Depression, which is like 1920s, 1930s.
Mm-hmm.
So there is quite a bit of time to also discuss the now, and it does give you more of a perspective of how did they end up here, and especially US politics. They really made sure that a lot of our readings are from 2025, which is very recent. Like, it's just this year, because they do find it important that we know what's going on. And it's also just, there's so many changes happening, and I think that's so cool in North America, that you're studying the changes while they're happening. But with that being said, you also study history, but again, your history, like, is in relation to what is happening now. It gives like context. It gives context on how the political structures are built and why, and also the mindset in America. And
No, but it's, as you're speaking about it, I feel like it's maybe, I have not talked with all the others, but it might be the only region where you talk about, to this extent, current politics and how it's affecting your life, which is, I think, very interesting. And I think it's important to learn things while they're happening. Yeah. Talking about studying US history, what's the most interesting thing you've learned about US history?
I really, really enjoyed learning about the Vietnam War and what role America played in that. I actually wrote an essay about American women in the Vietnam War, and that was one of my favorite things to write to date. So I think that's one of the most interesting things. But also, the Second World War is really interesting from an American perspective, because I grew up in Europe, in Western Europe, and I think the Second World War is obviously a little bit taught differently to us, because we just had, like, as a country, a different experience than maybe America. So, but I thought that's a really fascinating topic as well, because while Europe was getting destroyed, America basically bloomed in that time. So I think that was really fascinating to learn.
No, it sounds very interesting. You're talking about, like, the US being active participant in the war, but at the same time, domestically they're blooming, and, well, Europe is being bombed flat.
Yeah.
The US is building, I don't know, skyscrapers, and yeah. So we've talked about this, but how intersected the US is in the global economy. And I think we really see that with Trump's tariffs, and also how he've pulled funding from a lot of international aid. How do you think studying US economics has shaped or changed maybe your views on Trump's economic policies?
Well, the tariffs of Trump's, it gave obviously real perspective of how much countries rely on America. And the tariffs are also not a new idea. Like, even Bernie Sanders was talking about tariffs, maybe in a different way than Trump is doing it, but it's not necessarily like just Trump's idea, which I think is interesting to learn about. But also, our system of how we have it in Western Europe is quite set up because of the American system. When you think of the Bretton Woods Conference and just the welfare states, well, you could maybe argue that Europe went a bit farther with the welfare state. A lot of it did start in America. And I think that's very fascinating to learn about, because our economic system is quite, our basis for our economic system is like the US, at least for Europe.
Yeah. So by learning about the US economic history, you're also learning about European economic history in a way.
Yeah, in a way you are, yeah.
And I think at this point, the global economy and in general, countries are so intersected, and so we live in a very globalized world. So regardless of if you're, in theory, only learning about the US, you're learning about the world as well.
Yeah, and I think that is something when studying the US, you are only studying the US, but I think it's one of the regions where you probably talk most about also the other regions, because you talk about the US relationship with Latin America, US involvement in the Middle East, US involvement in the Vietnam War. The US is just, it was involved in a lot of stuff, for better or for worse, but so there's a lot also to talk about in those relations, which I think is really interesting. I do think another misconception that I want to talk about is that America doesn't have any culture. So what do you study when you study culture of America? Which I think is such a kind of simplistic view of culture, if you say that, because culture is just an everyday lived experience, and obviously everyone has a certain culture. And also when you think of movies, like Hollywood movies, they're also from the US, and that's also a cultural phenomenon if you want to talk more about high culture. And I also think it's so diverse. There's so many different ethnic groups in the US who all has their own culture. And for example, like rap originated from the Bronx in New York. So I do really want to say to students that don't think that the US don't have any culture and you won't learn anything in culture, because it has an incredibly rich and diverse culture, which I think is really interesting. Also, you're also going to learn a lot about indigenous cultures and languages, what to me is like one of the favorite things to learn about. So I do want students to know that.
Good to know. So then we've come to the final question. What is a song that you feel like summarizes the North America as a region?
Well, there's so many songs I think that would represent the USA, like Party in the USA, you know, like.
No, as you said, it's so culturally diverse. It's
yeah, a lot of rap songs would probably also work for the US, but I'm gonna talk about, I think, Bruce Springsteen. I feel like we even discussed him in the history. He has a lot of songs that really give a little bit of information of like historic moments that shaped US history. So I would say him, a singer.
Yeah. Well, thank you for coming to the podcast, and thank you for letting me interview you on your podcast.
Okay, so that's it for today. Give yourself a round of applause if you made it all the way to the end of the episode. And I hope everyone had fun listening and still learned something.